Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to EWRI for inviting us to come talk with you all about the latest happenings at the Texas Water Development Board. I want to especially acknowledge and thank all the EWRI officers and volunteers that have helped put together such an outstanding event year after year. This has been a yearly workshop since 2006, and its success is due in no small part to the volunteers that make it happen every year. Virtual or not, it is a lot of effort, and so thank you all again very much. At this point, the last speaker slot is obligated to say that we'll try to go as quick as possible, acknowledging that we're the last talk between you all and happy hour. But with our current virtual situation, you all easily could have had several pre-happy hour drinks by now. And I dare all of you, if a chat box is available during this presentation, to tell us if you've started or not. My name is Saul Nuccitelli, and I'm the Director of Flood Science and Community Assistance at the board. I'm going to talk a little bit today about the board's overall flood efforts and focus a bit on the mapping initiatives. At a real high level, the Water Development Board fulfills its mission of securing the water future of Texas through three functional areas. First, water science, of which I'm a part, focused not just on data collection, but also on analysis, education, and support for planning and project work. Second, water planning, through close collaboration with communities and regions in Texas. Third, water finance, which provides support with community and regional planning and construction projects through a variety of grant and loan options. Fourth, an area that supports all others, not shown on this graphic, but it's important to mention nonetheless, is TNRIS. They serve as a clearinghouse of geographical data and the state's Geographic Information Office. The Water Development Board was created in 1957 and has been developing water planning since the 60s. We've been even collecting water-related data through a predecessor agency since the 30s. And while this graphic has a water supply theme, which was the primary focus of our agency for many years, things began to change following a series of flood events across the state in 2015. Prior to 2015, we had about a dozen staff or so in these four programs shown here focused on flood. And even with very little statewide funding, these programs were fairly impactful as they leveraged both federal and community funding and support. These programs are all continuing today, with the somewhat exception of the state flood protection planning grants, which isn't really gone, but was absorbed into the much larger flood infrastructure fund, which has both a grant and a loan program. Then in 2015, there was a series of floods across Texas. The Wimberley flood, flooding in Southeast Texas, and across the state. And we started developing several new initiatives and systems that help better communicate and coordinate weather and flood risk data across the state. And I'll briefly touch on at least the bottom two, TexasFlood.org and the State Flood Assessment. In 2018, the board conducted the state's first statewide flood assessment. We started this work with legislative funding in 2017, which ended up being the same month as Hurricane Harvey, which you could either see as bad or good timing. This effort provided an initial assessment of Texas's flood risks, an overview of roles and responsibilities for various agencies and communities, and an estimate of flood mitigation costs, and then finally a summary of stakeholder views on the future of flood planning. That summary of stakeholder views was developed from extensive outreach, which included several statewide surveys, a bunch of regional workshops, many conversations at conferences and individual meetings with a wide variety of contributors. There were basically four key conclusions from the assessment. Number one, the absence of coordinated planning efforts at either regional or the state level. There were some rare exceptions though. Second, the critical absence of quality data and maps. Third, there was a strong sentiment that the lack of quality data, maps, and science dramatically limited our ability to do flood mitigation. And so we needed to get better at it. And then fourth, pretty wide recognition of the need for significant funding, along with the recognition that without having done prior work, our estimates on what we think might be needed in terms of funding is limited. In other words, we kind of don't know how much we need because we haven't done all the work to figure it out yet. As a result of what we learned from the state flood assessment, our governing board made recommendations to the 86th Texas Legislature, last one, and it was informed by the top 3 priorities as identified by stakeholders. First, improve flood risk mapping and modeling. Second, provide financial assistance for flood planning, flood mitigation planning. And then third, also provide financial assistance to implement those flood mitigation efforts. This is generally a model that was inspired in part by the water supply planning process in Texas, which we all know has worked pretty well. Each of these pillars were addressed as part of several bills passed by the last legislature, including Senate Bill 7, 8, 500, and House Joint Resolution 4. These bills created several new funds and processes. Following the passage of the new funding and legislation, the board went back out on the road to talk with folks about how to implement these new programs. These additional discussions and opportunities for feedback informed our current efforts and shaped our new flood initiatives, which includes the creation of 2 new divisions at the agency: flood science and community assistance, and then also flood planning. Within the flood science and community assistance division, we have several new staff and also some old staff and new roles. And of course, I am obligated to note that we are still hiring, including positions for the manager of our flood modeling team and senior engineering positions. So if you have any interest at all in joining us in developing these new statewide flood programs, I would love to talk with you about that, or please check out the postings on our website. I also want to touch on the Flood Infrastructure Fund, the FIF. I'm sure many of y'all may have recently submitted abridged applications for consideration, and if you didn't, I'd be curious to hear why not. We did try hard to make this initial abridged submission to be as easy and straightforward as possible to submit. As noted here, FIF funding can fund projects in advance of the first 2024 state flood plan, but assuming funding is available 2024 and later, it can also fund projects that are developed as part of the state flood plan. We received a lot of abridged applications, and the Water Development Board is currently processing all applications to verify eligibility amounts. The next step will be invitations for full applications projected for late summer or early fall. Any updates on schedule or other items will be reflected on our website and with direct communication to those applicants. If you haven't already done so, please consider signing up to receive email alerts on this and all flood-related topics from the board. Also, I think it's very important to note and really emphasize, and you may have already heard some about this today as well, the Water Development Board is not the only state agency that provides state funding or manages federal funding for flood-related activities. We've long understood that it's pretty darn confusing for Texas communities to sort out which flood funding opportunity is best for their needs. So if you're not already aware, I want to make sure you go check out the new Texas Flood Information Clearinghouse website. This is a collaborative effort between the Water Development Board, TDEM, the Texas Division of Emergency Management, and the Texas General Land Office, GLO. In addition to providing information on all the various flood funding opportunities, you can also simply submit a pretty quick 23 question, so pretty quick, RFI form describing your needs and goals, and we'll get back with you on where we think you might best pursue funding. Our 3 agencies are holding regular coordination meetings to compare various funding requests, as well as find more ways to make applying for funding as simple and transparent as possible. Okay, so now I'll focus in a bit on the flood mapping side. First off, here's a status of Texas coverage for FEMA's flood insurance rate maps. Half the state has either no maps or paper maps, all that stuff that you see in white, that they're greater than 10 to 15 years old or so. About 20% of the state has DFIRMs, digital flood maps, that are greater than 10 years old. Another 20%, 5 to 9 years old, and then finally about 10% or so with pretty new maps. An important caveat, though, to understand is that when some maps are updated, it does not necessarily mean that all the creeks and floodplains in that area have been restudied. And so many newer maps still have older flood risk data for certain areas. So suffice to say, some of our data is pretty old. So acknowledging that FEMA maps are both costly and time-consuming to update, there's been a partnership of federal, state, and regional agencies that have been advancing more rapid flood map development using non-regulatory products. If we stay out of all the due process of formal FEMA maps and the insurance, we can update flood maps faster. But first, we need to have full LiDAR coverage, which gives us high-resolution topographic data to build from. And the good news is we're pretty close. TNRS is helping us get there along with the USGS and FEMA and other agency partners. Green, as you see on the map right now, is currently available, and most of that is 2016 or more recent. The remainder of the state out west has already been flown and should be available later this year. Some of the brown pockets that appeared over the green areas in central Texas and the east parts of Texas are reflecting a planned update cycle that is occurring on an ongoing basis. Basically, we're in the mode of refreshing our LiDAR now as well. With new LiDAR as a base input data set, we're developing a newer non-regulatory product called base level engineering. This provides models, maps, GIS data, and reports freely and easily available for download. Purple reflects completed or in progress work. The 3 shades of green is a general phased approach, generally moving from east to west, since the westmost LiDAR is the last to arrive. Each phase may be a year or a little bit more in duration. The real black lines that you see are the regional flood planning group boundaries. So you can get a sense that the eastern regions either have or some will have or some already have complete coverage before the western regions. Here's a snapshot showing the website where you can view and download this data. The areas shown in purple from the last image are what are currently available online. Most recently, we added the Atascosa watershed, which is just south of San Antonio, to the viewer. Next steps for BLE include filling out the rest of the state. We still have a lot to go, 150 or so watersheds. Our goal generally is to complete by 2024 or sooner. We're in close collaboration with FEMA, the GS, and other partners in completing this effort. Most of the new funding is going to come from either the Water Development Board or FEMA with some regional partner support. And we also still intend to accelerate our production pace with additional consulting support with an RFQ coming ideally in the next month or two. Zooming out a bit. So the Water Development Board, we're the state agency that has an agreement with FEMA, a CTP agreement with FEMA, Cooperating Technical Partner Agreement. So we're focused on map updates here. But the BLE isn't the only mapping effort we have going on, though it is by far the biggest. We're also continuing to update FEMA firm maps too. The main near-term focus is generating new BLE so we get complete BLE coverage. But our longer-term focus will be transitioning to BLE maintenance and then firm updates as well. Changing gears a little bit, TexasFlood.org provides information on the most critical steps to take before, during, and after a flood event. At the top, icons shown here in red provide links to websites that display flood conditions. So the first icon are the rivers rising. That'll link you to TexasFlood.org map viewer, which gives you a sense of river flooding across the state. Second, icon in red, what's the weather doing? That links you to the Texas Mesonet website, which shows current weather conditions and some historical conditions. And then how full are the lakes? That links you to a lake viewer page. The site also has links to helpful information, including road closure data from TxDOT, FEMA floodplain, and flood insurance information. We are currently working on a next generation of TexasFlood.org, and I'll talk about one new area of improvement that we're working on. So when you click on Are the Rivers Rising? That links you to this map, the TexasFlood.org map. Most people think TexasFlood.org is just the viewer, but it's meant to be all those other things as well. In any case, when you're in this map, you get a decent sense of where the rivers are flooding. You kind of see orange dots or yellow dots or whatever, and you kind of, okay, here's some flooding coming or flooding happening. But then when you click on one of those dots, you see a recent past and current river elevation and discharge at a specific flood gauge. And then you also see a forecast plot provided by the Weather Service or the GS. So here's an example of that. The bottom left graph here shows one of those charts. Current conditions is basically where that kind of line is halfway through the chart. Everything to the left, those blue dots, are what's happened in the past. The purple dots are what's projected to happen in the future. And this graph, I happened to take a snapshot last Saturday of the Rio Grande River near Lower Brownsville. And that was projected to peak sometime Wednesday, which, as you're hearing this recording, will have been a couple days ago. These are great charts with helpful information, but for the average citizen, they have no idea what a potential peak of 26.6 feet means. And so that's where this Flood Decision Support Toolbox comes in. This tool, which is a visual on the right side of the screen, a visual showing what the tool, part of the tool on the right side of the screen, was developed by Inform, which is a group of federal water agencies and primarily USGS, to help graphically show the extent of flooding from a given forecast depth. So with the FDST, you can use a slider bar to estimate what depths inundate which areas. And it's easy to slide up and down a foot or two to get a sense of what could happen. Because of course, as we know, predictions have a lot of uncertainty associated with them. Right now, statewide in Texas, there's limited availability of this tool. And in fact, the graphic that you're seeing here on the screen, the graphic on the right, does not match up with the graph on the left. But we are working with the USGS to expand the coverage. And we're seeking to connect statewide building footprint data from TNRIS to provide on-the-fly depth damage estimates over certain areas. That would allow you to get a sense of how much property damage might be expected in a certain area based on a certain flood depth. All this is planned to be publicly available with the simple use of that slider bar. I wish I could say we're the first ones to work on such a helpful tool, but alas, Texas is not the first. You can go to other state websites, such as those for Iowa and North Carolina, and see variations of this theme already built. But we're catching up, and we definitely plan to learn and build from those other efforts. There are additional national initiatives underway to better understand flood risk too. We're staying in touch with these initiatives to see where we can best synergize and leverage our state efforts. One is NOAA and the Weather Service's National Water Model. It's intended as a next generation in flood forecasting. It takes a wealth of inputs, and the output is near real-time flood forecast with hydrographs. This would drastically increase the number of forecast points nationally and in Texas. It's still sort of in a beta mode, so not yet ready to replace the other forecasts, but there's a lot of significant ongoing efforts to improve it. Nonetheless, data is available online right now for review and for use. Also, you may have seen in the news real recently, literally a month or so ago, the First Street Foundation. They're a technical nonprofit. They're teamed with many universities, including UT. They develop new flood risk data across the whole continental United States. What they did is they found a way to, at a kind of a massive scale, do two-dimensional, unsteady modeling on a fairly coarse 30-meter DEM terrain. But then interestingly, they plotted those results on a finer 3-meter DEM terrain. To me, that's a little reminiscent of FEMA's redelineation efforts in years back, where what FEMA had done back then is they mapped prior model results on new terrain, but without redoing the modeling. In this case, the modeling is pretty new, but they're not doing the modeling on the 3 meters. They're doing the modeling on the 30 and then just plotting it on the 3 meters. In any case, the 2D surface modeling is combined with coastal models that include sea level rise, and they also consider changing rainfall risk over time as well. They provide additional information on rainfall, on recent and historic flooding, and national comparisons to FEMA's maps. All this is freely available online. We've met several times, we, the Water Development Board, have met several times with folks responsible for this work, and we're discussing potential collaborative opportunities, but it's important to note that we, the board, have not yet performed any formal review of their process or results to date. So if you intend to use this data in Texas, you'll have to decide on its merits versus other data that may be available on a case-by-case basis yourself. So to wrap up, two main, perhaps obvious, but important points to state nonetheless. The Water Development Board is investing a lot with other agencies on base level engineering for Texas statewide, and it will be very helpful for flood risk awareness, floodplain management, and many other uses. Second, different products are getting developed fairly rapidly and provide different types of insights on flood risk. At the Water Development Board, we are looking to leverage all applicable data to improve our flood planning and mitigation efforts in Texas. That's all I have. Thanks for listening, and happy to answer any questions that you all may have.